April 6th, daylight. The remakes have overtaken the world. Somehow, no one has new ideas. The very well-made Resident Evil 2 remake only came out a year ago, and we already have another new release, Resident Evil 3 ODST. That joke works because it's actually a very fair comparison. A game that is pretty much an expansion being sold as a full-price game, but with a still pretty decent single-player campaign, and a tacked-on multiplayer mode. With the single year of development they had for this game, I'm far from surprised that things have turned out this way. But there's more to Resident Evil 3 than its rushed development. Let's go on to the good stuff first. As far as modern action horror games go, mechanically, the Resident Evil 2 remake was fantastic. Resident Evil 3 uses that gameplay system as a base, but plays quite differently. The original Resident Evil 3 was the most action-focused of the classic series of games, and those traits have been blended into the Resident Evil 2 remake mechanics. Things like Jill's dodging and the button mashing to push enemies off, these were things introduced in the original Resident Evil 3, and they make an appearance here. Narratively, they have a context too, since Jill is meant to be tougher and more experienced than Leon or Claire. Likely for balance reasons, the whole support weapon system from Resident Evil 2 is gone. So Resident Evil 3 has some minor gameplay tweaks, but these small changes make a big impact on how the game plays. I personally prefer how Resident Evil 2 plays, since it feels a bit more horror oriented. That being said, I'm very happy that Resident Evil 3 plays the way it does, since it means we have two games that play in their own distinct ways, rather than two games that play exactly the same. Although I hope Capcom puts more of a horror focus on their future titles. The Resident Evil 3 remake shares a lot less in common with its source material compared to Resident Evil 2, which is one of the things I actually really like about it. This game and this game are too different from a functionality perspective. So to restrict the remake by making it rigidly follow the design of the original game is only going to hurt it. But the Resident Evil 3 remake feels a lot like its own independent game. It has some level references and some gameplay similarities, but not too much more. The original game is always going to exist and is still fun in its own right, so I'm glad that this remake is trying to be more of its own thing. Frankly, I wish we could get away from remakes altogether. These games are good already. The way your new games play is great. I'd like a game based 100% around these mechanics with a new story. Speaking of story, this game also departs from its source material a lot on that front too. In my opinion, the story in the original Resident Evil 3 is the worst among the classic series of games, since it's basically a mix of the plot from 1 and 2, but told worse. Thankfully, the remake distances itself from the original. It's not purely another we need to escape story. Jill actually has stuff to do. She's trying to rescue civilians and then after that try to get a vaccine. It's super basic, but your character's having some kind of objective in place of nothing is a big plus for me. Nikolai is working for someone outside of Umbrella and just wants money. Again, super basic. But at least that's some kind of motivation and he's not just evil Umbrella Man. There's a few other things that help with the story too. In the original, Nemesis just infects Jill and that's that. In the remake, it's set up that Jill has recurring nightmares about being infected. So when Nemesis does infect her, it's like her greatest fear and nightmare coming true. Before the outbreak occurred, Jill was planning to leave Raccoon City on October 1st. She ends up leaving on that date later in the game. The entire opening of the game itself is actually awesome, from the spooky start to running through the streets. The bowling head and the hunter POV are both cute callbacks to the original Resident Evil, and Jill and Carlos have some fun bants here and there.
You mean the alley that's on fire?
Maybe. Surely a tall drink of water like yourself can put out a few flames.
Fuck you.
The story is still not great, but I think the Resident Evil 3 remake did a better job of adapting its story than the Resident Evil 2 remake did. In my mind, the number one problem with this game is a simple one. The game feels too episodic and segmented. The most fun I had in this game was at the start, where you're in the heart of Raccoon City and the game is relatively open. There's lots of stuff to do, things to unlock, different ways to get to certain areas. It's classic Resident Evil, an interconnected area with lots of stuff to do. That's one of the core parts of what makes a Resident Evil game great in my eyes. The Resident Evil 2 remake nailed this. The police station is this large, interconnected complex, which gives you lots of options in how you get from A to B, but is in constant flux to mix up your travel habits. Here in Resident Evil 3, the Raccoon City section is quite small, but also happens to be the largest section in the game, with following levels behaving more like a shooting gallery that you pass through once. It's not awful, but it feels so linear that it impacts the game negatively. I have a feeling that it was designed like this because of the rushed development, where it might have been easier to make a series of small levels than it would have been to make one giant interconnected level. It's a shame that the game was rushed like this, because that initial section in Raccoon City is just so much fun. Oh man, the first mandatory Nemesis fight. This is gonna be tough. Oh, it's over. Yeah, Nemesis is a bit tame here. He was truly tough in the original game and required some decent skill to beat. Nemesis battles here are either easy or a bit gimmicky. There's a few too many of these run away from Nemesis sections in the game and they just feel a bit lame. You don't even fight him too often. He spends a lot of time just in cutscenes. The opening is totally awesome and sets up Nemesis as the antagonist really well. But after a certain point, you need to transition away from cutscenes and have it be more gameplay oriented. The original game handled that better, I think. Maybe all the running away is meant to be like a callback to the original game where you had the option to fight or avoid Nemesis when you encountered him, but it was the player's choice for which option they went with. You could run away or fight Nemesis at almost any one of those opportunities. This is one of the hardest fights in the series, and when the original did have its gimmicks, they were a bit more clever and purely optional. This section in the sewer is just not good. I think this level and the new version of the Hunter Gammas are meant to be a sort of remix of this battle with the Gravedigger, which is a clever idea, but it's just a corridor with enemies that you can't really get past that kill you in one hit. It's just not very engaging. If you compare it to the sewer section in Resident Evil 2 with the G adults, here you have the space to avoid them, you have options in how you deal with them, and they don't insta-kill you. I just think this whole section in Resident Evil 3 is bad. Hunters are back, and so is their ability to kill you in a single hit. I know hunters could do the one-hit kill in the original series of games, but your health had to be in caution at least for that to happen. And even then it was annoying. I don't know why they wanted to bring this attribute back, but also implement it in an even messier way. I won't say much about it, but the story in this game is still not very good. They do try to improve on it, but not enough. Since the original game's story is pretty bad, making a brand new story for this game might have been difficult, but I call it like I see it. It's an overly basic plot with some pretty thin characters. If it's going for the schlock, cliche action movie type story, it's nowhere near fun enough. It certainly doesn't feel like a horror story. It's just this weird mutant plot of different genre tropes, and it doesn't quite work. Perhaps patching and mending the broken story of the original took too long and they just ran out of time to improve it further. I sympathize with the writers since I think they would have had a tough job here, and they made a lot of steps in the right direction, but they spun straw into copper and not gold. One last thing, the dialogue needs tidying up. The script in-game feels more like notes or like a first draft compared to a finalized script. There's some fun stuff like I've said previously, but there's some parts where it's robotic and unnatural, like it hasn't been drafted yet.
You see? You're learning. The only life that matters is your own.
The insults and the swearing in this game can feel a bit unnatural and out of place too. However, all the voice work is fairly decent. These actors are trying. It's just the dialogue that really needs a rework. The Resident Evil 3 remake is a good game. It's a fun game. The fact that it's short doesn't bother me. The fact that it's action focused doesn't bother me either. The fact that the story is still not great doesn't bother me too much. The fact that it's so linear is what bothers me. As I said, I'm guessing that because they rushed this game out in like a year is the reason why it's as linear as it is. Part of me is unhappy about the rushing since it brought down the quality of this game, but at the same time, rushing this game out means we can just move on. I'm glad this game exists, but I want them to take all the good things from their latest releases and make a brand new Resident Evil game that isn't heavily based around some kind of previous title. I just hope whatever that game is turns out well. Careful what you wish for, right?